Have you ever put on a VR headset and you felt, almost completely transported, like you're really there? But then just one tiny detail,
Yeah.
or maybe the lack of a detail, it just breaks the spell. You're flying over these amazing digital mountains, or maybe exploring some ancient ruins in VR, and then boom, you reach out to grab something, your hand goes right through it. Or you expect the scent of, say, a virtual rose, and nothing, just air. What are those really subtle sensory cues, like the actual feel of a digital cushion you're sitting on, or maybe the faint smell of that virtual rose? What if they're way more critical to how your brain perceives reality than we've ever really imagined? So today we're doing a deep dive. We're looking into this really fascinating study. It's from 2025 by Capkan and colleagues. The title is An Exploration of Digital Human Cognition Through Sensory Perception Across Real and Virtual Selves. Bit of a mouthful, but our mission today, basically to pull out the key insights, the real nuggets of knowledge about how our senses work together or sometimes against each other in both real and virtual worlds.
And crucially, what all this means for actually creating truly immersive digital experiences for you. And here's maybe the aha moment, something that might actually surprise you. Picture this, a VR medical simulation. A student feels that subtle resistance of virtual tissue, maybe even smells the antiseptic in the virtual operating room. This study, it suggests those seemingly small cues are building a kind of blueprint for muscle memory. So deep it actually carries over from digital to real, helping them become a more confident surgeon in the real world. It's pretty amazing. You might be surprised that, well, our brains process touch and smell quite differently based on whether we're in the real world or a virtual one, and how something really simple, like just seeing something, a visual cue, can totally transform that whole sensory experience. We're going to unpack how understanding these little nuances is frankly essential for everything from better virtual training right through to just more engaging, more believable entertainment. Okay, let's dig in. The core idea here, it kind of revolves around something called digital human models, or DHMs. Now, don't just think of them as like fancy digital avatars.
They're more sophisticated. They're computer models designed to simulate not just how humans look and move, but also, and this is key, human cognition, how we perceive things, how we reason, make decisions. And for these models to really mirror us, to feel genuinely realistic, they have to account for our full sensory experience. It can't just be about what we see.
Exactly. And what's truly fascinating here is how adapting these cognitive models, these DHM, specifically for virtual environments, VEs, lets us understand precisely how our perception, how our decision-making actually changes when we step inside a digital world. And this is critical for, well, for so many applications. You mentioned training simulations, right? Highly realistic ones where you learn by doing. Also mental health interventions where feeling truly present is vital. And even, developing more sophisticated, more believable AI avatars that we interact with. For a long time, researchers kind of assumed, maybe implicitly, that people experience virtual and real worlds pretty much the same way. But this study, it really challenges that assumption head on. It opens up new ways to think about designing these experiences.
Right, so focusing on modeling cognition in VEs.
Yeah.
How does this study really shift how we should approach making virtual worlds feel, well, genuinely real, not just looking good, but feeling right?
Yeah.
It sounds like it's more than just, adding more senses into the mix. It's about something deeper.
That's exactly it. Realism isn't just additive. You can't just keep piling on sensory inputs and expect it to magically feel real. It's what we call an emerging property. To really boost that sense of realism, that feeling of presence for the user, you need accurate synchronization. Synchronization of different senses, both in space and in time. And this study, the one we're diving into, it specifically investigates how aligned or maybe even misaligned cues from smell, touch, and vision, how they affect your sensory awareness. And ultimately, your overall feeling of realism within these VEs. It's really about building a coherent picture for your brain, not just like bombarding it with random sensory data.
Okay, so how do they actually test this? The study design sounds like it needed to be pretty clever.
It was quite well thought out. They recruited 24 participants, all self-declared healthy, aged between 20 and 39. And importantly, they randomly assigned these participants to different experimental conditions.
Random assignment. That's key to avoid bias, right?
Yeah.
So everyone doesn't get the same order of experiences.
Precisely. It avoids learning effects or order effects. The study used what's called a between-subject design, meaning each person experienced only one specific set of conditions.
Okay, why is that important? Between subject.
It prevents what we call carryover effects. For instance, if you smelled a real rose first, that memory might influence how you perceive a virtual rose smell later on. That could skew the results. So between subjects keeps each experience clean. They manipulated two main things. First, the environment, Was it real world, RL, or virtual environment, VE? And second, within those environments, there were 3 different levels of sensory cues.
3 levels. Okay, what were they?
First, the control conditions. Pretty straightforward. No added smell, no added texture. Participants just sat on a standard plastic chair. This gave them a baseline reading.
Got it. Baseline. What next?
Then, the high-level sensory conditions. And crucially, these included a visual cue. So here, both the smell, the olfactory stimulus, and the touch, the tactile stimulus were present. And you could see their source. For example, there was an actual rose in a glass vase visible on a table, and a cushion was clearly visible on the chair. This setup explored how smell and touch interact when you also have that strong visual confirmation, much like in the real world.
Okay, makes sense. Visible cues and the third level.
That was the low-level sensory conditions, this time with no visual cue. The smell and touch stimuli were still there, so the rose odor was present and there was a cushion. But their sources weren't visible. No rose in the vase, even though you could smell it. And the cushion on the chair was hidden, masked with a plain nylon cover. This let them isolate the effect of just the smell and the touch without that reinforcing visual information.
Right, so you could feel the cushion but not see it was a cushion. Or smell the rose without seeing a rose. Clever. So how did a typical session go? What did participants actually do?
For each condition, they sat in a quiet room which was physically replicated for the VE condition. They listened to a standard 3-minute English conversation through headphones. For the virtual part, they used a MetaQuest 3S headset. And the virtual room was designed to look exactly like the physical one.
Okay, mirrored environments and the specific cues, the smell and touch.
Yeah, the olfactory cue was a 5% rose oil solution diffused into the room, so a subtle but definitely noticeable scent. And the tactile cue was a linen-covered cushion about 5 centimeters thick placed on that plastic chair. After the 3-minute listening period, they finished the experiment and then answered a bunch of questions about what they experienced.
What kind of questions? What were they measuring?
They focused on several key things. First, their subjective feeling of being in a real room, that sense of presence. Then, their ability to actually detect the odor and the texture. And not just detect, but also correctly identify them. Did you smell something? What was it? Did you feel a texture? What was it like? They also rated things like the intensity of the smell, how pleasant it was, and the roughness of the cushion texture. And one more thing, they used an olfactory awareness scale beforehand. Basically, a quick smell test.
Why the smell test?
Just to make sure everyone had a broadly similar baseline sense of smell. So if they found differences in odor detection later, they could be more confident it was due to the experimental conditions, not just because some people naturally have better noses than others. It levels the playing field for perception.
Right, controlling the variables. Okay, so they've got all this data. What did they find? Let's get to that aha moment again. When they put all the senses together, smell, touch, and the visual cue, especially in VR, what really stood out about how real it felt?
Well, this is where it gets really compelling. When all those sensory cues were present and, importantly, coherent, meaning the smell, touch, and visuals all matched up, participants reported a significantly high feeling of being in a real room, even in the virtual environment. Get this, 75%, 3/4, of the participants in the real-life condition with the visual cue rated realism as 5 out of 5, the highest possible score. And even in the virtual environment with a visual cue, 50%, half of them also give it the top score for realism.
Wow, half the people in VR felt it was perfectly real when the senses aligned visually.
Exactly. It really drives home the point that making sensory cues not just perceivable but actually visible is a really powerful strategy. It significantly boosts that critical sense of presence in VR. And this lines up with other research too. When feedback from different senses aligns with what you're seeing, your brain is just far more likely to buy into the experience, to accept it as real.
That integration piece is huge. Okay, but let's break it down further. Were there, unexpected differences between how senses worked in real life versus VR? Did smell or touch behave differently?
Oh, absolutely. And this is where some findings might seem a bit counterintuitive at first. Take odor detection, for example. It was actually more accurate in the virtual environment conditions compared to the real-life ones.
Wait, really? They detected the smell better in VR?
Yes, significantly better. Participants in VE were much more likely to detect the rose odor. They also perceived the odor as being more intense in VR. The average intensity rating was 3.75 out of 5 in VE, compared to only 2.12 in the real-life setting. And another interesting layer, correct odor detection and identification improved when the source, the rose vase, was visible. And that was true for both real-life and VR.
So seeing the rose helped you smell the rose, whether real or virtual.
Precisely. It points to something called the super additive effect. The idea is that combined stimuli, seeing the rose and smelling it, are more effective together than just the smell alone would be. Think about walking into a bakery. You see the bread, the pastries, and that visual probably enhances the aroma, makes it seem stronger, easier to place in your mind. This study suggests that same principle holds true even when you're fully immersed in a virtual world.
That's fascinating. Our sense of smell might actually be heightened in VR, especially if we see what we're supposed to be smelling.
Yeah.
Okay, but what about touch? Was that better in VR too?
No. Touch was a different story. Surface detection, noticing the cushion texture, and identification describing it were actually more reliable in the real-life conditions.
So the opposite of smell. People were better at feeling things in the real world.
Yes. Participants in the real-life Sanger perceived the texture quite differently and more accurately compared to those in VR. There was also a significant difference in how well people could describe the texture depending on whether they could see the cushion versus when it was masked. This difference in VR, why touch was less reliable. It might be due to something called higher cognitive load.
Cognitive load, meaning their brains were too busy.
Kind of. Essentially, the brain is working harder just to process the novel virtual environment itself. Navigating it, making sense of the visuals, understanding the space, that might leave less mental bandwidth available for processing more subtle tactile sensations like the texture of the cushion. Your brain is prioritizing understanding this new digital landscape, potentially dulling other inputs like touch slightly.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
The novelty of VR could act as a bit of a distraction from finer details like texture. Okay, so let's zoom back in on those visual cues then. What did the researchers really learn about how just seeing the source of a smell or a touch change perception? And were there any more surprises comparing real and virtual?
This is really a critical takeaway, and it highlights a pretty complex, nuanced interaction between the senses. Overall, the study confirmed that when visual cues were present, participants were better at detecting both the smell and the touch cues. That visual confirmation helps, but the impact wasn't identical across environments. Visual cues significantly enhanced odor detection in real life, but interestingly, they had less of an impact on odor detection in the virtual environment.
Why less effect in VR for smell?
Well, likely because, as we saw, olfactory perception seemed to be already heightened in VR to begin with, so the visual cue didn't add as much extra boost there. But conversely, for touch, the visual cues specifically improved surface detection in the virtual environment. Seeing the cushion made people more likely to notice and identify its texture in VR. So these findings really paint a picture of this intricate dance between our senses. Vision influences smell and touch, but how it influences them depends on whether you're in the real or virtual world. It underlines that you really need to tailor how you use sensory stimuli depending on the target environment. You can't just assume what works in real life will work exactly the same way in VR. It requires smart, context-aware design.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, what's the big picture takeaway from this deep dive? It seems pretty clear our senses don't behave exactly the same way in real versus virtual spaces. Smell detection, surprisingly, may be better in VR. Touch detection, better in real life. But the real linchpin seems to be that visual cue, right? Seeing the source boosts our awareness of both smell and touch, just in slightly different ways depending on the reality.
Absolutely. And these insights, they're incredibly valuable for anyone designing, building, or even just using virtual experiences. By understanding these, well, sometimes subtle but really profound interactions, designers can start to optimize VEs much more effectively, make them feel more realistic, sure, but also make them more effective for their purpose. Imagine, say, therapeutic VR applications. Knowing that a calming scent might actually be detected more easily in VR could make those relaxation environments genuinely more potent, maybe reducing anxiety more efficiently. Or think about those training simulations again. If simply making a virtual tool or a machine part visually clear enhances the user's ability to perceive its simulated tactile feedback, well, that could lead to much better skill acquisition, better muscle memory. It goes beyond just fun and games. It's about making these virtual experiences truly impactful tools.
Yeah, it feels like this research offers a kind of roadmap, a way to integrate senses more intelligently, to boost cognitive engagement, maybe improve therapeutic results, or just provide richer, more believable entertainment.
Yeah.
It's all about building virtual worlds that truly trick your brain, maybe, make them feel fundamentally real and meaningful.
Exactly. Now, it's important to add a small caveat. This study, while fascinating, did have a small sample size for each specific condition, only 4 people in each group. So the findings should be seen as preliminary, more descriptive than statistically definitive just yet. But it lays incredibly important groundwork. Future research could build on this significantly. For instance, exploring how our senses might adapt over longer periods in VR. Do we get better at sensing touch in VR with more exposure? Or, moving beyond just awareness, how do these integrated sensory cues actually improve performance on tasks within the VE? That's a really exciting next step.
Definitely food for thought. So maybe next time you're in a virtual experience, whether it's for work or learning or just pure entertainment, think about it. What senses are engaged? What's missing? And how might adding or improving, say, a specific smell or a particular texture, especially if you could see its source, how might that completely change your feeling of reality inside that digital world? It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How deep can this dive into our digital selves and our digital senses actually go?